Let's get started. Good afternoon and welcome to our session today. I'm honored to be here with you today and discuss this important topic. Showing up to this session really speaks volumes about our shared commitment to protect children and build safer communities. My name is Lindsay Burkhart. I'm the former director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force, and I now serve as the director of prevention initiatives at Families Flourish ND. One thing that you're going to notice before we start is that, wow, Lindsay, that's a lot of color on your screen. Yeah, it's bright and colorful, but that design choice is so intentional. The color, the colors reflect hope, the hope that we hold for every child's future, and the belief that prevention is not only possible, like it's powerful, and we are able to prevent child sexual abuse. And for me, who the person doing some of this work, it's a powerful reminder that while this work is heavy, that it's rooted in possibility, action, and hope. I want to say a couple more things before we start. Thank you to the North Dakota Hope Project for trusting me with this session. Also, I hope you're all staying warm. I know how bitterly cold it is. And lastly, thank you. Thank you for being here. We had over 140 people sign up. I see we're about to 80 people right now. There is a plethora of options of education out there and webinars and trainings. And I just want to thank you for taking this next hour to spend with me. This information is vital. Your presence here matters. So let's jump into our agenda for our time together. What I want to say is that let's save questions for the end, if it's possible, just so we stay on track and we make sure that we get through all the content. And I want to emphasize that everything in my session, it's very important to me that what I'm putting out there is based on evidence, research. So if you have any questions about where something comes from, you'll have my email at the end of the session and you can absolutely reach out at any time. Oh, I'm going to fix one thing here okay, there we go. I'm going to share a little bit with you about who I am. So my name is Lindsay Burkhart. My background is in early childhood education. So I've worked with Families Flourish ND for a few years now. Prior to my current role, I was the director of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force. And upon the task force dissolving, I took over the role of director of prevention initiatives here at Families Flourish ND. I have four kind, smart, funny, beautiful daughters. I'm also a community volunteer. I volunteer with a program called Bio Girls for the last 5 seasons. Bio Girls is such an important program for me as it has a mission of improving the self-esteem of adolescent girls. The other thing, I actually didn't add this in here, but I'm also a volunteer. My daughter and I are volunteers with the Humane Society of the Lakes. And so we get to go to PetSmart every couple of weeks and volunteer, and she gets to play with and socialize with the kitties, and I get to scoop their cat boxes. So she has the better end of the deal there, but been a fun experience for us. A sort of fun fact about me is I'm an ordained minister. That picture on screen is me officiating my sister's wedding. I've conducted 3 weddings and I have 2 more in the next couple months here. So I'll be up to 5 weddings. I feel like I'm growing in my confidence in this area because one of my really good friends, I officiated her first wedding and she asked me to officiate her second. So I must not have done too bad of a job if she's asking me to do it again. But that's just a little bit about me. And the information I'll be sharing is far more important. So we're going to jump into that. But I do want to say one thing that I do this work not only to create a better tomorrow for the children all across our state, of course, for my girls, but I'm also motivated to do this work for the survivors in my life that I love. I'm surrounded by many survivors from friends, family members. But this is also for all survivors. There are an estimated 42 million adult survivors across the United States today. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the emotional weight of today's topic. The information I'll be sharing throughout the session may be difficult to hear and it could be potentially triggering, whether it connects to your personal experiences, maybe situations you've encountered in your work, or simply just the weight of the issue. Please take care of yourself throughout our time together. And if you need to step away, um, please feel free to do so. But maybe don't step outside because you might get hypothermia because it's so, so cold. But just in all seriousness, please take care of yourself. That's what matters. And if you need to step away, please do so. And I want you to also know that you're not alone in feeling the impact of these conversations. We're going to start off our session just by talking through some of the trends and truths of child sexual abuse. It's going to be quick, but it's going to be pretty comprehensive in the conversation we're going to be having. But first, before we start, we need to take a minute to define what child sexual abuse is. And I like to use the definition that the task force developed just a few years ago. So the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force defined child sexual abuse as any interaction between a child and another person in which a child is used for sexual behaviors and activities through contact or non-contact behaviors. It's a mouthful. We categorize sexual abuse into like two main types, really. So we have contact and non-contact. Contact abuse involves any form of physical interaction with a child that is sexual in nature. The one thing I want to point out quickly is, so when we came up with this definition, one of the things that we added in was non-contact behaviors, because prior to this, we didn't include those in our definition. So we further defined our definition, as you can see below. So when we say child, we're talking about any individual under the age of 18. When we reference another person in our definition, we're talking about an adult or another child. The other thing, like I said, we wanted to define and add into our definition was those non-contact behaviors. Non-contact abuse doesn't involve physical touch, but it can be just as harmful. And those examples include someone who would like voyeurism, watching or looking at a child's naked body for pleasure, exhibitionism, someone exposing their genitals to a child. It could also be something like exposing a child to sexually explicit material like pornography. The one thing that I like to make sure that we talk about here is that it's important that we acknowledge that research shows non-contact abuse, those non-contact behaviors, are significantly linked to adolescent distress and lower quality of life. And I think these findings reinforce the importance of recognizing non-contact abuse as a serious form of child sexual abuse, because it's often more easy to overlook or to minimize. But what we learn and have learned through research is that the emotional and the psychological toll is real, it's measurable, and it's deeply impactful. So with the understanding, and after we defined what it is, what is the prevalence of child sexual abuse? Many state and national organizations estimate that about 1 in every 10 children will be a victim of child sexual abuse by their 18th birthday. I want to point out that there was a recent study published by NDSU in May of 2025, and this offered deeper insight into the scope of child sexual abuse across our state. And unlike projections that are based on current youth data, this study looked retrospectively. They asked adults across North Dakota about their own childhood experiences as part of a broader assessment of adverse childhood experiences, also, and what we often know it better as ACEs. And when it came to sexual abuse, 11.3%, which is about 1 in every 9 of those respondents, reported experiencing at least one of the following before they turned 18. And those were being touched sexually by someone at least 5 years older or an adult. The second was being coerced or pressured to touch someone else sexually. And then lastly, being forced to have sex. Did you happen to notice that they only asked about those physical forms of child sexual abuse involving touch or sex? The study didn't quite look at those non-contact forms of abuse. And that data, all of this data reminds us that prevention isn't just about protecting our children today, but it's also about recognizing and responding to the lasting impact of abuse across generations. From the national statistics to the NDSU study I just referenced, it's important to acknowledge that these numbers likely underestimate the true scope of the problem. Some research estimates that up to 33% of victims never tell anyone they were abused. And I'm fortunate because I get to talk all across North Dakota on this topic. I get to go to big organizations and small organizations. And I say that every time I say that, 33% of victims never tell anyone they were abused. I just can't express the heaviness on my heart that I feel. That's such a heavy secret to carry an entire lifetime. Well, we learned that same study that found up to 33% of victims never tell anyone, they also found that when they do disclose, it often takes decades. So that same study found that the average age of disclosure was 52 years old. So it's important for us as adults who love and are around children to really understand what keeps children from disclosing. And according to the National Blueprint to End Sexual Violence Against Children and Adolescents, it's because victims often feel confused. Maybe they feel shame and embarrassed. They're worried about getting in trouble. It could be because they have a conflicted feeling of loyalty toward the abuser. They maybe are worried about being labeled loveless, shunned. What about being afraid of being taken away from their home or destroying the family? What we also know is that abusers may threaten to physically harm the child or someone the child loves or their family pet if they tell. More than one survivor has told me that I had no idea what was happening to me wasn't okay. The words echo I just remember feeling like stopped in my tracks when a survivor said to me, Lindsay, I didn't know until I was 12 years old what was happening to me was wrong. And this is something that we need to understand because many children don't disclose abuse because they genuinely don't recognize it as abuse at the time. They don't know that what's happening to them isn't okay or that it's wrong. Research shows that lack of understanding, especially when the abuser is someone trusted, is a major barrier to disclosure. These barriers, all of them that we talked about, remind us that the true scope of child sexual abuse may never fully be known. One thing that the longer I've been in this work, the more I've really tried to understand and learn about the factors that may increase a child's vulnerability to being abused. So we'll take a minute to talk a little bit more about that. For us, parents, caregivers, those who love and work with children, it's important that we understand risk and protective factors because it helps us recognize vulnerability and where vulnerability comes from. So when we identify or when we say risk factors, we mean characteristics or conditions that increase the likelihood that a child may experience sexual abuse. And when we say protective factors, so on the other hand, those are characteristics or conditions that can reduce that likelihood or can help buffer the impact of risk when it's present. The one thing before we jump into these and talk through these a little bit, I want to say that having risk factors does not mean that a child will for certain be abused. And having protective factors doesn't make a child immune to abuse. Child sexual abuse is complex, and no single factor causes or prevents abuse. The other thing I think before we jump into it that's important to note is that research in this area is still evolving. We continue to learn more about how these factors interact all the time. So first, let's talk about some of those risk factors, those things that increase a child's vulnerability. One of them is prior victimization. So children who have been harmed before are at a higher risk without strong support around them. Could also be violence at home, exposure to domestic or interpersonal violence, family violence, harsh physical discipline. All of those increase vulnerability. Weak parent-child relationships, low connection, or inconsistent communication. And research on child maltreatment shows that poor parent-child relationships and emotionally unsupportive family environments increase vulnerability because children have fewer emotional protections and fewer trusted adults to turn to. This kind of goes along with that. So family social isolation, fewer supportive adults around them, fewer eyes on the child, And when a family is isolated, typically they have greater caregiver stress as well. And we'll talk just about two more before we flip to protective factors. The other one is non-nuclear family structures or non-biological caregivers in the home. This for the child has higher average risk due to opportunities for accessing the child. It's not due to the structure itself. And the last one I wanted to share is disabilities or significant health needs. What we know is that then there's an increased dependence on adults for care. And there's also typically or can be communication barriers that can also increase that vulnerability. So now let's flip and start talking about those things that can lower the risk, which are those protective factors. Strong caregiver child relationships. We know that reduces maltreatment risk overall because emotionally supportive caregiver child relationships and positive parenting practices they create protective conditions that reduce the likelihood of abuse and neglect both. Body safety education is considered a protective factor, not because it makes children responsible for preventing abuse. Children are never responsible for preventing abuse, but because it helps give them skills, language, confidence that reduces vulnerability. Adult training is important because adults create safer environments when they know what to look for. We also know that social support really matters. And when caregivers have that social support, it reduces that parental stress and it increases a family's protective network. One thing I want to note is that even when we build in every layer of safety around our child, we teach them every body safety rule, we do everything right, sexual abuse can still happen. And abuse is always the responsibility of the person choosing to harm. It's never the child's fault, not the family's fault. Let's talk really quickly about who the abusers are most often. Some of us grew up as our only form of child sexual abuse prevention education was stranger danger. It was a really dominant message around child safety for decades. Especially, I guess for me, it feels like throughout the 80s and 90s. And I think, or I believe, it was largely shaped to high profile national cases like a little boy from Minnesota named Jacob Wetterling or a little boy named Adam Walsh. Some of you remember those children. Those stories left a lasting impact on communities all across our country and shaped how we thought about child safety. And while stranger danger was well-intentioned, we now know that the greatest risk comes from someone a child knows, not a stranger. But that said, guidance about strangers is still important. Stranger perpetrated cases still happen, and children benefit from having simple, age-appropriate rules about interacting with unfamiliar adults. So what do we know about the abusers? Well, we know that it's typically someone the child knows. 90% of children are sexually abused by someone they know. And you can break that down even further, as 60% are abused by people the family knows and trusts. So it could be a family friend or a neighbor, someone who works at the church, someone at the school. 30% are abused by family members. Children being abused by other children used to account for a staggering 40% of cases. And when I first started, that was a statistic that drove a lot of the work we did. I'm just knowing that 40% of children were abused by their kids. But there was a study done by someone named Dr. David Finkelhor, and he is the director of the Crimes Against Children Research Center out of New Hampshire. And he did this national sample. And I think he looked at over 10,000 children and youth who had been victims of child sexual abuse. And what they found throughout this study is that 70% of children who were sexually abused were abused by other children or youth, not adults. This challenges many of our assumptions, and it highlights the importance of understanding developmentally appropriate sexual development in children. What's healthy, what's normal, what to look for. Because when we know what's typical or expected, We're better equipped to identify behaviors that are concerning, coercive, potentially abusive, and we can intervene early and potentially prevent sexual abuse from happening. Today in our session, we don't have time to review child sexual development, but I will share a resource with you where you can learn more. Abusers aren't always the creepy strangers that we have built and created in our minds. In many cases, people who sexually abuse children don't look dangerous. They often appear friendly, likable, trustworthy. Sometimes they're even people that we admire across our communities. And I want to remind everyone again, and I might say it again throughout our session, but all information today is about abuser behavior, never blaming victims. Children are never to blame. What we know is that abusers often target children who seem lonely, emotionally needy, shy, socially isolated, because these traits can make children more receptive to attention and grooming. Many abusers seek children who appear quiet, compliant, less likely to resist or to disclose. One thing that I find vital to bring into more and more sessions is a damaging myth that continues to exist. I've heard it from people in the field. I've heard it from some of my interns who have joined me to walk alongside me. But I find it vital that we talk about it. Some people assume that individuals who were sexually abused as children are at a much higher risk of sexually abusing children. So people believe that someone goes on to abuse because they were sexually abused. I want to tell you that the evidence there is very thin. I've heard it many times. Does it happen? Yes. Are these victims at a higher risk of abusing others? No. It's really critical that we challenge that misconception because it can stigmatize survivors. And I love many, many survivors. I feel the deep need to share that. And it can distract us from what truly prevents sexual abuse. Abusers often build relationships with children and their families before the abuse occurs through a process called grooming. We're going to talk a little bit more about grooming. I believe that it's one of the most important patterns for adults to recognize. Grooming is a complex, deceptive process. One that often masquerades as trust building or mentorship until it's too late. According to recent research, they found that 99% of survivors of child sexual abuse reported experiencing at least one grooming behavior, red flag behavior, before the abuse occurred. 99%. This really underscores the importance of recognizing grooming as a central piece of child sexual abuse and a key area for prevention. As you can see on the slide, grooming is when someone builds a relationship with a child in a deceptive way to make sexual abuse possible, all while keeping it hidden. You can see that there's really 5 stages of grooming. That's where the abuser chooses a victim, their victim selection, finding ways to be alone and isolate the child. The third one, building trust with the child and the family, gradually crossing boundaries with the child, and then using pressure, secrecy, or manipulation to keep the child quiet. Let's circle back to number 3 really quickly. We know that in some cases, abusers also groom parents as well, often by becoming unusually helpful or dependable in ways that slowly lower a family's guard. We also know that grooming can take place over short or long periods of time. We also know that it can happen both in person or virtually. And what did we learn when we talked about abusers? That it's typically done by someone the child knows and trusts. And the good news is, fortunately, adults can learn to recognize grooming red flag behaviors. We're going to talk about those next. So let's walk through some of these. These are considered red flag behaviors that may signal grooming. These behaviors are often subtle and they can be easily mistaken for kindness or care. Isolating the child, finding ways to be alone with the child, creating situations where others are excluded, offering rides, special outings, It could also be spending time in less visible areas. As if a caregiver is cooking, maybe we'll go play video games in the basement. It could be special attention or favoritism toward that specific child's privileges that make them feel special, chosen, set apart from their peers. Gift giving, buying gifts or treats with no clear reason. Boundary testing through touch. So this is being overly physical or touchy. This can occur in front of trusted adults. Boundary testing through touch is used by abusers who want to see how the child responds, what adults allow around them, and how much access they can gain. It's not about the touch itself, it's about testing permission, testing comfort, secrecy. And what do we know about secrecy? Well, we know that secrecy is a hallmark of grooming behavior. Sharing special secrets with the child or encouraging secrecy from parents and caregivers. This really creates a private world between the abuser and the child. And I don't know about some of you, but when I first started spending time diving into grooming, I was like, oh, well, great. My mom comes every time she comes to my house, she goes to the dollar store first and she brings a whole bunch of trinkets and, quite frankly, crap to my home for my children. No apparent reason. It's not their birthday. It's just because. And so, right? This sounds like something someone who genuinely cares about my child would do. And that is a valid concern that we feel that. But how do we tell the difference? The key is that we look for patterns. We don't look for isolated moments in time. The thing is my mom does that a lot. She does it. I feel like every time, or she's calling me like, "Hey, can you come pick this up? I bought this for the girls." Um, do I think my mom is grooming my children to abuse them? I don't. And the thing is she's not buying them for one of my daughters. She's not just saying, "Oh, here, this is for Emma. Oh, I want to have time alone with Emma." No, my mom comes with crap from the dollar store for all of them every time. It's not giving one specific child these special treats. We're looking for patterns where that's that one specific child. Look for those patterns, not isolated moments. The thing is, if someone is repeatedly seeking one-on-one time, that access, that alone time with one particular child, showing several of the concerning behaviors that we see on screen right now, maybe they're giving you that something feels off feeling. Trusting that instinct is important. You don't have to accuse anyone, but simply limit the child's access to, or that person's access to the child. Make sure those interactions are always supervised and observable. Another important signal that we need to be mindful of is if the child's behavior seems to shift or change around that individual. Things like sudden clinginess, withdrawal, anxiety, discomfort, or cues that something might not be right. Children often communicate through their behavior, their bodies, before their words, so we need to always pay attention. As we wrap up this session, or this section, we're not done yet, on grooming, I want to emphasize that it's important to exercise caution when you see adults giving unusual amounts of attention to a child, touching them unnecessarily, even if it seems playful. While we know that not every kind neighbor and doting family friend is an abuser, unfortunately, we need to be alert to the possibility. Remember the statistics. 90% of children are sexually abused by someone they know, affecting 1 in every 10. I have the great honor and the privilege of working with survivors and parents of child victims, and many over time have shared with me that they were able to recognize the grooming process, but it was well after the abuse had occurred. Dr. Georgia Winters, an expert in the sexual grooming behaviors of abusers, she has found that we tend to see behaviors like horseplay, sitting on laps, that unnecessary touch, the gift giving. We only really see those as problematic after the abuse has occurred. This is called hindsight bias. It's a painful but a common experience. And as we close this slide, I feel compelled to go back to this. 99% of survivors in one study reported experiencing at least one of these red flag behaviors. And my main goal is to help adults recognize these patterns before harm occurs and empower adults to act protectively, quickly, without shame or fear. I like to give this space for this. As we talked about when we first defined child sexual abuse, we know that it doesn't always include physical contact. And what we also know is that physical signs of child sexual abuse are less common. According to the University of Texas Medical Branch, at least 90% of examinations of sexually abused children show no acute findings of trauma. Bruising, cuts, or swelling, especially around the mouth or genital areas, would be signs. Other signs may include, they're not limited to, but pain or difficulty walking or sitting. Could also be frequent UTI, urinary tract infections, yeast infections. Indirect physical signs may include headaches or tummy aches without clear medical explanation. These symptoms are often linked to the child's internal distress and anxiety surrounding what's occurring, even if they're unable or unwilling to disclose it directly. But what would be more common for us to see are those emotional and behavioral signs of child sexual abuse on screen. This list is not all inclusive. It could be a regression of outgrown behaviors, such as thumb sucking or bedwetting, mood swings, aggression, fear, or emotional withdrawal, self injury, cutting, burning, substance use in older children and adults, nightmares, night terrors, other sleep disturbances, low self esteem, thinking of themselves or their body as bad, dirty, repulsive. The one that always, and it still stands out to me a lot, is the one in the top left corner. Too perfect behavior, that overly compliant behavior that might not stand out to us, right? It's just a good kid, just gets good grades, does really good in sports. This stands out to me because, so I'm also a trained facilitator of Darkness to Light, and it really hits it home for me because I remember a video of that in that training where this survivor is talking about how she went or she turned into this perfect student after the abuse started occurring. She started to get straight A's. She started to excel in sports. She was just this perfect student, this perfect child. And what she went on to say is that it's because it was the only area of her life, the only thing in her life that she felt like she had control of. It's also important to note that these signs that you're seeing on screen, these don't automatically mean that a child is being or has been sexually abused. Many of these behaviors can appear in children experiencing other types of trauma or stress. But what matters is noticing patterns, thinking about duration, context to further that. So thinking about patterns. Maybe a child had a nightmare. Well, that's not necessarily a red flag. But what about nightmares along with regression, along with fear of one person? That signals a look, a closer look, more attention. What about duration? A child regresses for a week after a big life change. They started wetting the bed again. Well, that's a pretty common stress response, but it looks a little different when that regression lasts months without an obvious cause or an obvious stress in the child's life, right? That seems like a red flag. What requires follow-up, looking into. It's also important to keep in mind that some children display no signs whatsoever. And if you're like me, when like I think about that, that feels like a punch to the stomach. But here's the truth, and I want you and I hold on to this as a mother too, that our power doesn't come from catching signs. Our power comes from building trust with our children, having ongoing shame-free conversations with our children, creating an environment where your child knows they can come to you with anything at any time. Most child sexual abuse survivors experience psychosocial losses resulting from the trauma. And those losses include like a feeling of a loss in childhood, loss of innocence, loss of faith in God or a higher power. loss of family relationships, loss of self-esteem, loss of that personal power, loss of self, and the loss of the ability to feel joy in life. Some survivors cope through substance use, especially when trying to manage overwhelming emotions, manage untreated trauma. Mental health challenges such as anxiety, depression, PTSD, or eating related concerns are a common response. Some survivors develop physical health conditions, including chronic pain, gastrointestinal issues, and more. Trauma can affect relationships, sense of safety, and for some individuals, this can also increase their vulnerability to re-victimization. It can also include involvement in the justice system, and often it's as a result of survival strategies. A couple things that aren't on screen that are important. A clinical study of 430 sexually abused youth found that 34% had suicidal thoughts or behaviors. 34% had suicidal thoughts or behaviors. But when researchers combined both the child's report and the parent observations, that number rose to 45%. And it isn't just immediate, right? That was a study that looked at children and youth. A large-scale research review has also shown that survivors of child sexual abuse are approximately 3 times more likely to attempt suicide later in life. And lastly, one more important thing that's not on screen. I want to share that a 2017 study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that prior sexual abuse was the strongest predictor of being trafficked among justice-involved youth. For both girls and for boys, having a history of child sexual abuse significantly increased their trafficking victimization. People who experience or are victims of child sexual abuse often tell us that it affects their entire life, and research backs them up. I'll never forget when this beautiful survivor and friend of mine looked me in the eyes and she said, "Lindsay, it's like a dark cloud that's followed me my entire life. But I don't like to move on to the next slide and just move on from there. No, it's important that we acknowledge that child sexual abuse does not necessarily sentence a victim to an impaired life. Trauma changes a child's story, but it doesn't get to write the ending. With compassion, the right resources, and a community that understands, survivors can reclaim their power in their lives in ways that are beautiful and meaningful. Healing is not linear. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is this is always my favorite part of the sessions. I started in this work 3 years ago, 4 years ago now, as the task force director. And I was not well. Um, you know, I dove into this issue headfirst. I dove into it. I took trainings, I researched, I listened to survivor stories, I reflected on what was around me. Um, and it was really dark. I would say within 6 weeks, I was like, is this a job that I want to have? Do I want to continue to do this? Or because it feels a whole lot simpler, do I want to turn my back on this topic and just pretend like it doesn't exist because life seemed easier? It got to the point where I remember rocking at the time, my youngest. She was still a baby. And I remember rocking her at night and I'd sit and hold my phone and I'd be scrolling the sex offender registries. I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd run down the hallway and make sure that my children were safe in their beds. It was affecting me so deeply. I was scared. I was living in fear. So at that point, I needed to decide that, yep, we need to step away from this because this is not good for you, not good for our children. My children, they can't have a mommy who's living like this. Um, or, or I can look at it differently. I can change from looking through a lens of fear to looking through a lens of prevention and the power that we have in keeping children safe. You know what I decided? Here I sit. These are quick things. I just want to run through these. These are things that we can do to protect the children in our lives. One of the biggest things we can do is minimize opportunity. Child sexual abuse most often occurs in one on one situations. More than 80% of cases occur when a child is alone with their abuser. And we know, we've talked about this today, that abusers target situations where they can exert control. They can avoid witnesses, they can minimize detection, reduce that risk of getting caught. But what that all tells us is that we actually have power because if we eliminate or if we reduce one on one situations, we're actually going to reduce the risk of sexual abuse. Making sure that interactions that involve the children in our lives who we love can be observed and interrupted. For me, as a mom with 4 children, it doesn't matter if my child is talking to her counselor, asking to keep the door open just a little bit. Or when I brought them, and a lot of parents just dropped their kiddos off for swimming lessons, and I sat on the bench right there to watch, or having a play day with a friend. In our house, when we have play dates, my children and their friends don't go up to play in their rooms. They play on the main floor where I'm present. It could also be keeping doors open if they do have a friend in their room. Just making them easy to observe and interrupt. Another thing we can do is we can talk about it. To prevent child sexual abuse, we have to break through the stigma and talk about it. Having conversations like this one, open and honest conversations to discuss what it is, how it happens, and going along with that, knowing the facts, like the conversation we've had today, where we've learned it's typically people who know the child, happens to 1 in 10, grooming behaviors. Because if we don't understand child sexual abuse, we really can't end it. How do we prevent it when we don't even really know how it happens? Understanding the facts help us better protect the children in our lives. Grooming and red flag behaviors. We've talked about this today. Grooming can be difficult to recognize, right? It looks like normal, kind, caring behavior, but because it may not be, it's helpful to look for those patterns we talked about. Intervene early, even if what you think you're seeing may be trivial. Monitor technology. I'm not going to dive into this today because we have some great sessions coming up in this area as part of the sessions provided by the ND Hope Project. And I'm going to share in a couple slides how you can sign up for those. Pay attention to who children are spending their time with. And I don't just mean in person, I mean online too. Talking to them after they come off their computer. Hey, who were you chatting with? Or what were you doing? Who were you playing that game with? Also, again, how was the ride home from basketball practice? Asking more questions. Who did you sit with? Did you look at their phone? What did you spend your time doing? Being proactive. If a child seems uncomfortable or resistant to be near a particular person, asking why, or if there's a person in our lives who their interactions consistently make us feel uncomfortable, trusting our intuition. The big thing we can do is build that network of safe and trusted adults around our children. Remember when we talked about those protective factors? But these are people who we are choosing to intentionally be a part of our child safety team. Children should know that these adults are people who never ask them to keep secrets, who honor and respect their body safety rules, and who always believe them. They can always go to them. We know that people who sexually abuse children are likely to run in a different direction if they see that the parent is involved, the child is educated. In the words of one abuser, he said, if I drive up to a bank and I see cop cars, I'm going to move on. I'll go down the street and I'll rob a different bank. I always feel the strong desire to be very, very clear when I talk about this. Keeping children safe from sexual abuse is the responsibility of adults. However, these simple yet empowering skills can make all the difference in a child's life because the burden of prevention and protection must sit squarely on the shoulders of adults who are legally and morally responsible for the health and safety of children. But more than one adult survivor has said, if I would have only known from the first inappropriate touch that it was wrong, how different my life might have been. There have been interviews with conducted or convicted sex offenders, and they've said things like, if I had any idea that their caregivers were talking about body safety rules, they were talking about boundaries, I would have thought twice. I know there are people who believe teaching the skills that you see on screen take away a child's innocence, but my goodness, I believe it helps protect it. These are things I talk with my children about all the time. They're 2, 5, 8, and 10. The first one is autonomy. Autonomy means helping a child understand my body belongs to me. I decide who touches it and how. I have the right to say no if something makes me feel uncomfortable. Teaching bodily autonomy, that simple skill, isn't just helpful, it's protective. Research identifies body autonomy as a key protective factor in preventing child sexual abuse. Often, despite a child's protest of no, we instruct them to give Mimi a hug or give uncle a kiss goodbye. While well intentioned, I'm guilty of this myself. This this has the effect of teaching children that they don't have control over their bodies. Rather, we do. Go kiss them, go hug them goodbye. We need to remember that our actions with children send important messages. This reminds me of when I have a 5-year old who has the most contagious and like the sweetest giggle. And like if I get lost in those giggles with her and like just tickling her and she'll say stop and it's like, oh, one more. She sat up one time and she was like, Mommy, stop means stop. My 5-year old. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Consent. It's something children can learn early, and it's a powerful tool to promote safety and respect. Consent matters because it builds safe, respectful relationships and it helps prevent boundary violations and abuse. Things we can do to practice consent: asking before giving hugs, asking before picking up a child, listening when a child says no or shows discomfort, even through their body language. Those nonverbal cues are valid forms of communication. Narrating actions with our young children or nonverbal kiddos. I'm going to zip your coat now. I'm going to help put your sock on. Teaching kids to ask before borrowing items or playing games. My daughter Adeline, she constantly keeps me in line with things. And if I forget one of our body safety rules, well, there was a time I was just admiring these pretty blue eyes and this blonde hair and brushing the bangs out of her forehead, leaning down and kissing her on the forehead. And she looks up at me with those pretty blue eyes and she says, Mommy, you didn't ask consent. Yeah. When we start practicing these rules with our kids, they remind us and they keep us in line when we mess up. Let's talk about secrets. Secrets, surprises, private information. People who sexually abuse children depend on children to keep their secrets. Abusers have often said things like, this is our special secret, you can't tell anybody. And children who have not been educated about secrets often don't dare tell anyone. I would steer clear of using good or happy secrets because abusers have been known to groom children by using those terms. Surprises are different. They're eventually something that will be shared, like a birthday party, a special gift, special treat. One of the things I've incorporated with my daughters, and I'll just share it, you can choose to use it or not, is what can we use? Like if something's not a secret, but it's really not something we need to tell everybody. So we started using private information in our home. I just started to remind my girls that not everything needs to be shared. Sometimes it's kind and respectful not to share. And that's private information. And it could be something like a friend who has an accident on the school bus, or maybe someone got really scared after a movie, or a classmate who needs a stuffy to fall asleep in the light on. It's not a secret. It's not a surprise. It's just personal moments that don't need to be shared. And I tell my girls, if you're ever not sure, you can just ask Mommy. Teach anatomically correct names for private parts. We're going to spend a minute on this on the next slide. Teaching children that no one should ever look at, touch, take pictures of private parts. And again, they shouldn't look at or touch other people's private parts either. You can also say sometimes a doctor or parent may need to help with a private area, like checking on something for health. But this is only to keep you healthy and safe. It's never a secret. You can always say if you feel uncomfortable or you want like another adult near you. Encouraging privacy. This is huge when children are changing or using the bathroom. I want to share a story about my daughter Adeline here, but in honor of our time together, I'm going to skip over that. The one thing I still hear adults using good and bad touch, and we really need to step away from that. Um, our bodies are wired to feel good to touch. So sometimes something can be sexual abuse, but it doesn't necessarily feel bad. So using language like, and that could be really confusing for a kid. So using language like safe and unsafe touch is much, it's just better to use. Teaching them that safe touch are touches that make them feel comfortable, warm, and loved. Touch we want, hugs, pat on the back, maybe a snuggle. And then that unsafe touch is something that makes them, when you've developed body awareness with them, that sends that signal inside like I'm uncomfortable, I'm scared, I'm worried, makes them feel confused. Does anyone know this song if you have kids? Head, shoulders, knees and toes, knees and toes. By 2 years old, children are expected to know about 50 words. Among those are usually nose, hand, toes, and we teach them through games, rhymes, books. But that practice stops when we get to certain parts of the body. Words like penis, vulva, vagina, testicles, and anus are treated as taboo. For generations, adults have avoided these anatomically correct terms, replacing them with words like flower, cookie, pee-pee, or wee-wee, because it may make us feel more comfortable, but they create real problems for children. Imagine a child disclosing to their teacher, my uncle licked my cookie. To the teacher, that sounds like a snack issue, not a disclosure of abuse. No report is made. The child feels unheard. And despite doing exactly what we tell our children to do, to tell a safe adult, this misunderstanding can have serious and long lasting consequences. In one study, researchers found that 91 convicted sex offenders reported are in a study of 91 sex offenders, they reported that they're less likely to target children who know correct anatomical terms because it might increase their risk of getting taught. This doesn't need to be uncomfortable or awkward. It's just like we teach other parts of the body. Oh, you skinned your knees. Oh, let's wash our hands. I'm wiping your vulva to keep you clean when you're like diapering or in the bath or in the bath. It normalizes this language and it reinforces that these body parts are not shameful. Simple and powerful strategy to help our children. And look at the stat down there. Research shows that 89% of children can name most of their non-genital body parts, and only 10% can name the appropriate term for their genitals. Okay, we have 6 minutes left. I'm not going to rush this. Start early. Use everyday events to have these conversations, all of them around body safety rules. They're not one-time conversations, they're ongoing. They're built into daily life, from bath time to driving in the car, check-ins during dinner time. And most importantly, tell your child that they can talk to you about anything at any time. You'll believe them, and repeat this as they grow. So I want to share this video. It's hard to understand, but once you kind of catch on to what she's saying, you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, my body is private, or my privates are private. I can't remember how she says it, but she made up a song about her private parts. Just listen to it. I hope you can tune into it and kind of understand what she's saying. Oftentimes I get approached by people saying, I'm just too scared. I'm just too worried about bringing this up to my child. I don't want to scare them. And I really like to emphasize that when you're talking with your child about body safety rules, you use the same tone and the same attitude that you would about speaking to them about crossing the street safely, wearing a seatbelt in the car, wearing a life jacket when they swim. Those conversations could be scary too. But how we choose to talk to our children about this really matters. So here it goes. I'll jump into it a little bit, but here's her song. You don't touch me, I don't touch you. So I'll try my own, you have your own. You have yours, and you don't touch my body, but I don't touch yours. Cause the mind is special, and you have something special in your heart. Vulva, butt, the crack, nipples, armpits, armpits. Yeah, but they cover up with you too. Belly, belly,
Your body is very special. Before anyone before anyone touches you, they should ask what? They should ask for your permission, not right, girl.
Doesn't have to be scary. Every day, ongoing. Reinforce the messages. Your body is special. It belongs to you. Thank you for listening to that. I hope you could. The armpit one really threw me for a loop. I have to say though, she was 5 or 6 when she was singing this song, so I thought she did pretty good. We're going to wrap up our session really quickly here on just some resources. These are resources that came out of the North Dakota Child Sexual Abuse Prevention Task Force. We have a guide for schools, youth serving organizations, childcares, policies, training available. And then we have the guide for caregivers aimed at parents, caregivers, foster care parents, anyone who loves a child. These are accessible. Maybe I'll share them with Greg and he can send them out to participants today if that's possible. But here's a quick look inside those. Body safety posters, coloring sheets, conversation cards. These are just amazing resources. The resource guide has child safety on the school bus, overnight child care safety, mentoring safety. Here are some books for kids. There's so many great resources out there. Just find the right fit for you and your family. They help make these conversations easier if they feel hard or if you feel stuck. Additionally, like I said, I have the great honor and privilege of traveling all across our state to provide education and awareness. So if you are ever looking for more, you can reach out to me and we can talk further about that. As noted, as promised, I said that I would share this. This is a session coming up. I'll also share this flyer with Greg and hopefully we can get it out to all of you on nurturing healthy sexual development in our children. Lastly, if you haven't signed up for the upcoming sessions, please go to www.ndhopeproject.org where you can sign up for more. And I just really want to thank you for being here. I know this session is quick and I know it goes fast. And this information is not intended to cause alarm. It's not intended to cause panic, but it's here to help equip all of us with the tools to protect those little, sweet, beautiful children in our lives. Thank you so much.
Hey, Lindsay, there was a couple questions in the chat,
Okay.
or in the Q&A. Would you mind addressing those?
Yes. Let me see if I can. Is it this? Okay. Okay, so the one is how can we protect children? A network of trusted or safe adults. But what if someone that was in your network of trusted adult is no longer to be trusted? I would just talk with the child about that and be very honest about that. Again, not in a scary way, but I think that that can change, that can shift. People come in and out of our lives, and maybe people that were once felt safe maybe don't anymore. And just talking with our children about that, and then I guess I would just probably repeat it, especially after that changes, just to reinforce that we can go to our teacher, we can go to coach so and so, and we can go to so and so, and just leave that other one out. The name of the video, it's really hard to understand, little girl. That's my video from my daughter. I know, I apologize for that. The audio wasn't great. And then the last, I think that was it. Greg, did I hit him?
Yep, that was it.
Thank you, everybody.